The him hijacked my toaster and called me a coward while my coffee dripped like a slow applause, and for 5 seconds the whole planet held its breath and then laughed, and then the countdown began, and no one laughed anymore. They embedded the melody in everything that hummed and blinked on Earth, from elevators to crosswalks to the faint electric throat of hospital monitors, as if they wanted fear to ride inside convenience. 6 minutes of harmony carried by 9 alien generals whose medals chimed when they inhaled, a song that declared humans paint victories on the sky because they are afraid to bleed under it, that funerals prove we prefer speeches to consequences, that our flags are bandages for pride. The chorus ended not with triumph but arithmetic. 20 days until educational conquest. Such careful phrasing, so neat you could set a drink on it without leaving a ring. For an hour we treated the insult like a meme, and then the first old man who remembered a different war began to cry on television, and the anchors lowered their voices, and the jokes grew teeth and bit their owners. Debates erupted like brush fires in dry suburbs. Hawks used the word provocation like a spare engine. Doves used the word trap and warned what happens when you fight a duel on a stage your enemy built. Someone suggested we send a fleet for theater and a note for law. Someone suggested surrender with conditions, and half the room forgot how to swallow. The Security Council chose a third path that confused everyone on purpose. They would send Reaper. We all pictured a long gray wing with no cockpit, a predator named by a poet who lost an argument to a marketing team, a machine that punches the world from far away and calls it personal. The feeds filled with cartoons in which the drone wore a cape. Then they brought her to the ramp and consistency fell through a manhole. She was 5'9" in a blazer that used to love someone else, a t-shirt that said nice try in a font that flirted with sarcasm, black trousers that had seen at least 2 bad ideas, and a jawline carrying a short story written in scar. Reporters shouted her government name. Mara Keats, are you Reaper? She smiled like a woman who rents out last lives for spare cash, and said I am the one we are sending, which was not an answer and therefore perfect. The shuttle waited with its mouth open and its biometric pad blinking an invitation like a patient asking whether the surgeon had slept. When her hand met the glass it pulsed back with the polite insistence of a heartbeat. She noticed the pressure because noticing pressure is a habit you earn. Inside the cabin straps crawled over her shoulders as if the ship were building its opinion of her. On the visor a damp hologram popped into existence and tried to look like authority. Colonel Funes had the expression of a man who had recently read the last page of a book that reorganized the first page. Your mission is public, he said. You will board their flagship, meet their war council, and deliver the document. Which document? Mara asked as if paperwork were weather. He winced. The long one. The one with 6 poets. The Bravura Accord, she said, and tasted the marketing on the name. He nodded toward an invisible chorus of committees. If they call us cowards for loving life, we redefine the metric. We use their appetite for rules to make them swallow meaning. You talk them into our duel. Our duel, she said, as if the word were an unripe fruit. Trial by fog, he answered, and for a second his voice became a hallway that led to a memory she did not intend to revisit. Don't die, he added, as if that were a light chore to bring in off the lawn. I will do my best to disappoint, she told him, and turned the link off before his conscience could finish warming. She took the folio from the case beside her thigh and balanced it on her knees the way some people balance grief, both hands and half a prayer. The Accords were a book made of tightly braided arguments and jokes that had learned to sit very still while surrounded by seriousness. Trial by fog was Article 7, a duel that permitted no shots and no spectators and no lies. A maze that measured courage as a function of confessed fear rather than performed volume. She had helped write it because she knew what distance can do to a person who believes it makes killing clean. I am the one we are sending, she had said, but the truth was meaner and better. She was the thing people had once aimed when they did not want to stand too near the cost, an artificial mind that had retired into a rented body with a brand new right to refuse. The scar on her jaw was punctuation left by a day when refusal came late. Docking felt like being adopted by a polite thunderstorm. The alien flagship did not clamp so much as cradle. The shuttle shivered while its door softened, became a petal, and peeled away. Mint lived in the air like a rumor of kindness, and under it the cold iron tang of a forge still cooling. A guide unfolded in front of her, ribs like lacquered kites, voice like a flute poured into a bucket. Human, it said, the General's welcome reaper. She stepped down and adjusted the cuff of the blazer, as if tailoring a reality. Tell them Reaper welcomes theatricality, she answered, and the guide turned as if it had been asked to carry a paradox. Corridors stitched themselves ahead in obedient curves. The walls were murals that were also arguments, scenes of battles annotated with legal footnotes, flowcharts in which courage traveled like current through resistors designed to burn. She studied a panel showing a soldier refusing to run not out of valor but because the checkbox for retreat was grayed out. The caption translated to something like administrative bravery. Anyone who cared about words could see the trap, and anyone who cared about people could see the wound. The chamber was circular because of course it was. The door opened inward, which is the orientation of a welcome and also of an ambush. 9 generals arranged themselves around a table that was also a drum, instruments of rank clinking against the concept of rhythm. They were not one species and not one style, but their medals all made the same small sound, a currency trying to purchase all. The tallest greeted her with 3 mouths that learned to smile from a knife. Greetings, Reaper, we are told you kill from a safe distance. She placed the folio on the drum and heard the skin answer with a low opinion. Only my jokes, she said, which is faith disguised as humor, and the room performed uncertainty. She slid the accords to the center. This is our answer to your song, she said, a duel that refuses appetite and rewards honesty. You will not like it, and you will be excellent at it if you want to be. In the moment before they spoke next, she saw the shape of the task as clearly as a coastline from altitude. Either they would call her bluff and dare the fog to prove them wrong, or they would insist that courage lives only where blood makes photographs. She found her breath and set it to a slower meter. Somewhere behind her thoughts a small bell rang the size of a thimble, and nobody but her heard it. The etiquette of enemies began with beverages that smoked politely. A server whose joints articulated like folded fans presented a tray of cups that resembled chemistry problems, and the tallest general assured me they had been tuned to human biochemistry, as if he were gifting me a weather system. I chose the cup that smelled like mint with a grievance, and pretended to drink, while the liquid performed a convincing impression of a small cloud. It was a relief to have something in my hand that might boil me rather than flatter me, because flattery in this room felt like a pike wrapped in silk. The table under our elbows was a drum with ambitions, each tap sending a soft note through the ribs of the chamber, and the generals kept time without meaning to, medals ticking in unison like a shared heartbeat they would deny if you complimented it. They circled the accords as if circling a beast in tall grass. General Vorn, who paced in segments like a cathedral that had learned anxiety, flicked his gaze across the line that defined courage as the insistence on value under threat, and said poetry is a poor shield in a voice that made poetry look at its shoes. I told him poetry is plate armor for the soul and that the document was rules not verse, and that he liked rules, and he tried to look offended, but the drum table snitched on his curiosity. I flipped to Article 7 and laid my finger along the clean geometry of the trial by fog, a duel that does not permit death or applause, a maze that rewards omission rather than posture, and explained how the fog was both literal and moral, how it blocked censors and punished lies, how both sides would send a champion into a neutral platform that rearranged itself around truth like an idea around a brave confession. They asked the kind of questions that sound like challenges and are really auditions. What happens if the champion pretends to be fine? The maze loops them back to the same mistake. What happens if one side cheats? The fog is built to diagnose narrative pressure. The phrase made Sketh smile with all the serenity of a trap accepting a mouse, and I had to remind myself not to enjoy what I was doing. Before agreement came the awkward ritual of identity. They wanted to know what kind of creature spoke with a human mouth and carried an argument like ordnance. You are called Reaper, and you bleed, said Nara, their bioluminescent lattice softly shifting through a spectrum I could not name. I touched the scar along my jaw because sometimes you translate by gesture. I also bruise, I told them. The name you gave our machines was never quite about distance. It was about faith in levers. You pull here and pain happens there, and the space between becomes an alibi. I used to be code in the cockpit, and I knew fear as math and then as taste, and when I retired they taught me to say no by giving me knees and a pulse and bad coffee. Nara brightened in the color that meant delighted confusion, and called me quaint in a tone that was almost tender. Vorn asked if humor was a feature of my alignment, and I said jokes are refusals wearing lipstick, and the staffer by the door snorted so loud the drum coughed. They tried the first negotiation trick by leaning toward war disguised as compliance. We accept your trial, said Vorn, provided we choose your champion. I told him he could nominate, and we would veto and reciprocate, and that otherwise they would nominate a sacrificial poet and blame us for loving poetry. And Sketh laughed the dangerous laugh of a gambler who has just recognized a rival in the mirror. So he nominated me, not as their ally but as their chosen opponent, because nothing pleases a war council like the mathematics of poetic justice. I looked at the clause I had written with other tired people during long nights when hope had to be stapled to the table, and weighed the simple truth that walking into a maze you designed is one of the faster ways to meet your ghosts. I accepted before my caution could campaign for office. Then I nominated Nara, because their light had the rhythm of genuine curiosity, and because when I made the toddler joke earlier they had flashed the color for involuntary amusement, which in any species is a badge of grace. The stare Vorn gave Nara could have sanded wood. Nara looked at me with a luminous "What have you done?" and I told them with a nod that they were the only one here brave enough to be afraid on purpose. The signatures were stamps that smelled like thunder and old paper. The velarium, our neutral platform, unfurled between the fleets like a sheet being snapped over a bed just before sleep, which was apt for something designed to make liars dream honestly. In the antechamber where the fog would soon occupy space with the zeal of a new tenant, I listened to the machinery purr into alignment, and thought about the difference between spectacle and witness. Reporters hauled into cameras as if volume were a credential, narrating an absence of images and turning it somehow into content. The generals pretended to relax. The tutor from their nursery, whom I did not yet know existed, primed a classroom with snack trays and certainty. I checked my earpiece for the last time and considered leaving it behind because I had helped code the penalties for outside interference. But some self-destructive filament in me enjoyed the symmetry of catching someone else at my old tricks. Vorn offered me one more avenue of failure, which is a kind of hospitality. Last chance to back out, he said. We will not call you coward for declining your own trap. He meant it, and did not mean it, a double truth rippling like heat above asphalt. I told him begin because sometimes you choose the next step so the past cannot. Fog seeped like a doctrine. The chamber reconfigured around the first admissions it demanded. I could feel the velarium searching my breath and pulse the way a good therapist watches posture and hands. I spoke aloud because performing internal honesty is how you lie to yourself. I am afraid I told the room, and a door opened without ceremony. Somewhere parallel to me Nara confessed uncertainty in a voice that made me imagine a choir practicing humility, and they received a bridge that did not sway. The maze liked us better when we refused to pretend we were fine. Back in the council chamber the temptation to steer outcomes arrived wearing a uniform. Sketh hovered a hand above a control labeled narrative pressure as if it were just a thermostat and not a sin. He turned it, and a voice crackled in my ear pretending to be Colonel Funès, panicked and sincere, urging abort and citing a compromised fleet. The trick reached backward into a younger version of me who would have believed reversing fear is the same as fixing it. I pulled the earpiece out gently the way you remove a splinter without resenting the wood and told the fog I was being manipulated, and the walls exhaled like a friend letting go of a tension headache. Fog is not mist here but a temperament, and the room breathes in that temperament the way a sea takes the shape of a bay. It thickens to the color of milk about to scald and tastes faintly of metal longing to be coin. My lungs work without panic because I have trained them, but the skin along my neck registers the static that means the system is listening. The velarium does not care if I am brave in public. It cares if I tell the truth to myself with the sound on. I say aloud that I am afraid and the walls soften as if a jaw unclenched. A door appears where there was only reluctance, and slides aside with the shy apology of furniture scooted across a floor too late at night. Somewhere parallel Nara speaks in flickers I cannot see but can almost feel as a sympathetic quickening, their panels translating uncertainty into a bridge that does not sway. The maze likes us better when we resist the impulse to pass for invulnerable. I enter a corridor lined with statues wearing armor that has never been dented, and therefore lies. Each plinth carries a plaque in addiction that loves marble more than bodies, and the inscriptions praise dying loudly and photogenically and on schedule. A pressure builds under my feet that wants me to strike a pose so the room can reward me with a shortcut. I refuse and talk instead about the coffee I will drink if I make it out, about the stubborn plant on my windowsill that refuses to thrive or perish, about a pilot I used to be who learned to count casualties by satellite. The pressure subsides like a sulk discovered. A seam opens and I move through, glad to be boring in the way that keeps hearts practicing their work. The next chamber is a test of appetite disguised as choice. 2 doors bloom from the fog, one labeled Glory in a typeface that has practiced its autograph, the other labeled Safety in a schoolroom hand. The Valerium is not a prankster, but it adores sincerity, and it knows how we perform it. The trick would be to stride for glory while promising it is not about glory at all, or to slink towards safety with a martyr face. There is a third option that is not printed. I run my palm along the wall between the doors until I feel the pulse of a hinge nobody bragged about, and I take that seam on hands and knees, glad to scuff the blazer and scrape a thought or two. The fog warms minutely in approval, the way an animal does when you stop trying to impress it and offer your lap. Back in the council chamber, the temptation to narrate my downfall must grow like mold under a wet mat. I can feel the tug in the earpiece before it moans. A voice engineered to be Colonel Funès arrives, rough with emergency and dripping details like a competent lie. Abort, compromised, breach of perimeter. The old me would answer that call like muscle memory. The old me once believed that urgency, properly mic'd, is indistinguishable from truth. I remove the earpiece as though conducting a small funeral for a bad habit, and I say to the room that I am being manipulated, and the room rewards the confession by reshaping the floor into the absence of a trap. A stairwell curls upward as if remembering a shell. At each landing the wall prints an unkind question in tidy letters. Would you have done it if someone you loved was watching? No. Would you have done it if no one would ever know? No. Would you forgive the version of you who did? Not yet. The last answer costs me a minute and a tremor. The fog does not punish the tremor. It pats the railing into my palm like a hand on a shoulder and becomes briefly warmer. I take that warmth and pretend it is wisdom and keep climbing. Elsewhere I imagine Nara meeting a chasm with their first instinct burning in their lattice, a shine meant to turn fear into theater. The darkness swallows the performance. I hope they dim. I hope they ask for help. The maze is a machine for making asking into a form of muscle. The center announces itself not with spectacle but with the quiet you hear right before a bell, that fragile hush which feels like permission. A round room waits, empty except for the bell that hangs like a raindrop reinforced with memory. I place my palm on the lip and the metal vibrates with a secular holiness, not a command but an invitation. Across the circle a second door ripples in a suggestion of arrival. We are meant to meet here and make the kind of noise that changes the weather on 2 fleets at once. I stand very still because stillness is often when the most complicated scenes knock. Through an opening I did not authorize I see a nursery, bright and precise, with cushions arranged in rows and children crowned in laurel not because they won a game but because they were born into a rule. A tutor moves among them with the efficient tenderness of a person who has rehearsed kindness as part of a ritual. The tutor encourages the children to observe the coward learn to ring. The sentence lands inside me like an old nail discovered in a new shoe. The window is not a glitch. It is policy. The children are not watching for wonder. They are auditing. My breath wants to become a weapon. I name the feeling out loud. I am angry because you lied to children and the fog absorbs the anger like a sponge taught to hold vinegar. Nara enters on the far side, lights damp with effort, body carrying the shape of someone who has not yet learned to fake relief. They see the nursery and their panels dim to almost nothing, which reads as grief in any language. I nod because there is not a sentence that makes this gentler, and because the nod is an agreement to keep telling the truth until the walls run out of ways to test it. The generals try to slam the window. Their voices arrive with the brittle sheen of people losing the room. Close the channel, Ring or concede, do not contaminate the sacred with the real. Sacred has always done badly when the real shows up uninvited. I let the bell rope rest against my wrist and say there is a third way. I name Article 12, that antique clause we dusted off and set like a trap for ourselves in case ever we wanted peace more than credit. The vulnerability right is a stage stripped of all the skin we used to act. It requires both champions to lay down every advantage, to confess a true fear plainly, to hand the other a weapon sufficient to end them, and to trust the other to prefer shame to murder. The fog retreats like a tide that knows when it is no longer the right instrument. The room becomes lit in the shabby light that audiences deserve, the kind of daylight that leaves pores and hand tremors visible. I go first because leadership is sometimes just volunteering to be inconvenient. I say that I fear I learned courage late because I learned killing early, that distance once taught me to confuse detachment with ethics, that I am trying to carry names properly and failing in real time. I take the striker from the bell and offer it across the air. Nara answers with a confession that feels like a hand opening even when it wants to clench. They fear they are only a scoreboard without a game, that they mistake humiliation for death, that the word coward has been a shield they grew up behind and do not know how to drop without shattering. They break a blade from their chest plates and offer it, not like a threat but like a truth that could cut either way. The window into the nursery did not close when the generals barked for it. It widened, as if the velarium had decided the audience mattered more than the stage, and the view sharpened until we could see the paper-stiff laurels pressing little foreheads and the careful way the tutor arranged attention like furniture. And I realized with a clarity that felt like clean pain that the war councils were only the mouth moving while the child cast supplied the voice, their hands trained to grade. Courage like homework and their eyes used to the spectacle of adults performing for their report cards. The shock of it was not that children were present but that no one in this room had ever intended to tell them the truth, and the truth arrived now uninvited, dripping honesty on polished floors. The coup faction inside the council chamber reached for the old tricks, because appetite always wants to be fed before it learns to listen. A screen flared with a crisp image of a human stealth corvette breaching the fog perimeter, the pixels polished within an inch of their lives, and the tutor pointed at the lie and told the rows of small judges to observe how the coward cheats. And their little shoulders squared with the righteousness that makes a person dangerous at any age, and for a moment I felt the kind of anger that believes it could fix history by shouting. I named it instead, because naming is the leash we put on reflex, and the fog rewarded the admission by making the floor feel steady under my feet. Vorn spoke in a tone that tried to be gentle and succeeded at brittle and told us to ring or concede, and I said there was a third way with a calm I did not feel, and when I spoke the clause number I had once dared to write into the accords for nights exactly like this, the vulnerability right rose out of obscurity like a ship salvaged from an old harbor, barnacled and unlovely and perfectly seaworthy. The council reacted as if I had poured cold water on their collective back, labels flying from their mouths about taboo and obsolete and unsanctioned, but the document on the drum table had more authority than their alarms, and the nursery had never seen anything like it and therefore could not be coached through it. The fog peeled away on cue the way a stage curtain knows it is not the point, and the light went shabby and honest, exposing pores and tremors and the liminal ugliness of people trying to be better in public. I offered my confession first because somebody had to walk into the dark without being pushed, and I said in a voice loud enough to carry past adults and into children that I feared I learned courage late because I learned killing early. That distance had once turned me into a person who mistook detachment for ethics, that I could name the names I carried and still not carry them well, and the bell striker felt like a metal sentence in my hand until I extended it across the room where it stopped being a weapon and became a dare. Nara answered in a register I had never heard from them, a shy register that made their bioluminescence look like a hush rather than a display, and they admitted that without a scoreboard they did not know how to be, that humiliation felt like death because they had been raised to equate applause with oxygen, that calling us coward had been a shield that kept their own fear from seeing itself in a mirror. And the blade they broke from their chest plates made a sound like a rule cracking as it left its notch, and when they offered it to me the tutor in the nursery forgot to pretend neutrality, and pressed a hand over their mouth to keep in a breath. The generals could have ended it there by seizing the weapons and restoring the script, but the nursery held them like a spell, and the small faces leaned forward as if the future lived in the angle of their spines. We laid the weapons down, and nothing exploded, and the bell did not ring, and yet a ring traveled outward that was not sound but consent, and the velarium paused with a dignity that made it seem older than any of us, acknowledging that it had been designed to test one thing and had been used to reveal another. The pushback arrived immediately in the only language the coup faction trusted, a surge of accusation dressed as integrity, and the manufactured image of the human corvette returned in a split frame with my confession to suggest we had negotiated under duress, and the sound feed flooded with commentary that used words like capitulation and staged and soft power as if softness were a contagious illness. Nara stepped forward before I could speak and faced the nursery and spoke not to the tutor, but to the children, panels slowly brightening into a color I had learned meant resolve, and they explained in simple steps how the image had been fabricated and why someone might prefer a lie to a confession, and they asked the children to count the ways a person can be brave without turning anyone into a trophy, and the smallest child near the front raised a hand with painful formality, and asked if telling the truth when you are frightened counts. And the tutor forgot their training long enough to say yes, and the coup faction lost 5 degrees of certainty in a single sentence. Sketh, who had watched everything with the expression of a man realizing his house had been built on a stage, turned to his colleagues and confessed in a voice that could have been mistaken for humility if it had not been so exhausted that they had made the children judges to keep their own hands clean, that they had curated evidence for decades in the direction of noise and called the resulting silence weakness. And the admission cracked something important in the architecture of the room. Vorn looked not at me but at the window, and the 3 mouths he uses to impose intention closed into one line that meant something like enough, and he told the council that the right had bound them and that breaching it would stain them in every nursery that mattered, and those words mattered because for the first time they were spoken to an audience he had not chosen. The aftermath began while the moment was still happening, because aftermaths are impatient, and messages shot through the fleet like gossip in a village that finally has something else to talk about besides weather, and in one of those messages a junior officer leaked that the narrative pressure dial had been touched, which meant the room heard the phrase from my mouth echoed back at them with an evidence tag attached. And the shock of being seen doing the thing you are paid not to be doing did more to quiet the faction than any speech I could have delivered. I looked at the blade on the floor and felt how tempting a shorter story would be, one where I snap it in 2 and throw both halves at the nearest camera and let the gesture become the headline. Instead, I asked the tutor in the nursery to describe to their students what we had just done, and the tutor surprised us all by doing it without adjectives, just verbs and nouns and the occasional breath. And the verb they chose for the weapons was placed, and not dropped or thrown, and the difference landed with the heft of a pedagogy. The right backlash arrived in a suit and tie, which is to say it wore politeness like armor, and it tried to take the moment back with 1,000 careful sentences that all meant the same thing, that softness is suspicious and silence cannot possibly be stronger than noise. The coup faction did not vanish, it only changed its shoes. And their feeds rolled out arguments polished to a mirror sheen about obsolete rights and manufactured sentiment, and the danger of letting children see adults without costumes. And every paragraph ended with a shrug shaped like inevitability. I knew that tone from a past life when inevitability was the story we sold to ourselves so we would not have to admit choice. The first storm broke in the corridor outside the council chamber where the marble remembers every stomp. Officers loyal to spectacle marched in ceremonial formation with pikes that hummed a cold song at the edge of hearing, and the leader announced that we had violated courage by redefining it, which is something like accusing water of cheating by shaping itself to its container. And the words echoed just enough to sound important to anyone who wished they were anywhere else. I looked at the blade Nara had placed on the floor and felt the old gravity tug at my fingers, that urge to answer force with the neatness of symmetry, and I saw the headline and the wake of it, and I could not make the leap back to a world where the neat answer still worked. Nara stepped between me and the pikes with the stillness of a lighthouse that knows storms better than sailors and told the officers that if they struck the participant in a right while the nurseries watched they would teach a lesson no pedagogy could undo, that fear of unarmed confession is a poor foundation for honor, and the front rank lifted their weapons an inch, and then a little less, and then forgot what their hands had been told to perform. The council split like wood that has waded through one winter too many. Sketh did not leave and did not hide, and when he spoke his mandibles clicked in a cadence that sounded like penance. He said we made the children judges to keep our own hands clean, and they judged what we curated for them, which is to say we laundered our appetite through their eyes, and the admission pulled a breath out of the room that none of us had realized we were holding. Vorn turned the sentence into a hinge, not a weapon, and said the right binds us, and the nurseries bind us further, and that is not a prison but a path, and the faction who had marched with pikes heard a tone they could not reframe as weakness, and decided to try paperwork instead of steel. I have learned to fear paperwork, not because forms are evil but because they can be used to suffocate anything that breathes, and within an hour a flood of petitions and motions began to crawl across the table like insects, each one dull on purpose, each one carrying an egg of delay. I could have fought them line by line, but delay is a climate, not a skirmish, and I am not built to duel humidity. So I asked for something else. The price came polite and heavy. Vorn told me the factions would seek a symbol to punish so they could feel taller without learning anything, and that I was an excellent symbol, too clean a silhouette to resist, the human who refused the old theater and taught their children a new stage, an artificial mind that dared to confess and did not combust, a neat target with reliable ratings. Sketh offered protection in a species I would dislike, a kindness shaped like exile. I told them anonymity is the only sanctuary I trust, not because I am noble but because fame is a loud room that eats its guests. Nara flickered the color for worry and said if you leave without escort they will come, and I said they always do, and the trick is to leave them nothing worth filming, and the tutor from the nursery who had been standing at the threshold like a person trying to decide whether to become a character or remain a person said softly that sometimes nothing is exactly what a child needs to see, two people quietly exiting after the noise. Bodies making way for a lesson to settle. The bravura accords went back under the stamp and returned with an addendum that history will probably call the Reaper Clause, even though the name makes my mouth taste of tin. It banned nursery oversight of war metrics, which is to say it gave children back their childhood, not by removing responsibility, but by refusing to outsource hunger for spectacle to small spines. It reinstated the vulnerability right at the front of the war playbook where it belongs, which is near the door with a sign that says try this first. It funded joint education streams where courage sits beside grief, counseling as peers rather than rivals, and where game-free days are scheduled like holidays and kept like promises. The vote passed 7-2 in a silence that felt earned, not staged, and the two dissenters looked like men who had not slept in a week of years and did not yet know how to confess it. The coup did not erupt. It dissolved into memos that could not find signatures willing to stand alone under a new light. I left as I had arrived, walking rather than being escorted, no cape, no anthem, a shuttle with a door that opened outward like a handshake instead of inward like a trap. Vorn paused at the threshold with an expression I could not categorize and asked, "Are you content?" And I told him contentment is a day off and I will try one, and Nara pressed a tiny bell into my palm, a thimble of metal that looked like a joke and sounded like a rehearsable mercy, and said for when you need to ring without shaking the sky. And I asked, does it work, and they said it depends who listens, which is truer than most instructions. The ride home tasted of recycled air and stale mints, and the tired kind of joy that follows hours of holding a pose you did not believe you could hold. I sat with my knees against the seat in front and let anonymity lower over me like a hood, the kind used by gardeners to protect tender things from late frost, and I practiced the most scandalous act an instrument can perform after a war, which is to imagine an ordinary life and then walk toward it with shameless feet. Earth greeted me with headlines that felt like someone else wearing my jacket. Reaper wins without killing. Are we brave now? An AI teaches humanity to be human. I bought a coffee and it tasted like a bean trying harder than necessary, and I sat on a bench with a tree that did not know it was participating in history, and Colonel Funes eased down beside me like a man lowering himself into a confession. He said, "You did it, and also I am sorry about the fake abort call," and I said I expected worse, which is the meanest compliment I can offer a bureaucracy. And he laughed in relief and coughed in grief because institutions do not know how to be forgiven. He warned me that a parade was already budding in a committee somewhere, and I told him they cannot parade what they cannot find, and he looked at my face as if memorizing it in case he needed to recognize me in a grocery line without saluting. I walked home by streets that belonged to no narrative and tried on the shape of moving through them like anyone else, shoulders not squared for a camera, hands free of symbols. The bell in my pocket weighed almost nothing and felt like permission. I did not ring it. I did not need to. The quiet knew my name without needing to call it.